Is there a seconder?
Second.
Ordered that the document be brought up. It has been moved and seconded that the following bill be read a first time. Evidence Amendment Number 2 Bill 2022. As many are in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, say nay. Ordered that the bill be read a first time.
A bill for an act to amend the Evidence Act to provide for the presumption of death where a person disappeared in circumstances of peril.
Further readings of first readings of bills.
Mr. Vice President, I beg leave to introduce and have read for the first time a bill for an act to amend the International Business Companies Act.
Is there a seconder?
Second.
Ordered that the document be brought up. It has been moved and seconded that the following bill be read a first time and tabled. International Business Companies Amendment Bill 2022. As many are in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, say nay. Ordered that the bill be read a first time.
A bill for an act to amend the International Business Companies Act.
Further first readings of bills.
Mr. Vice President, I beg leave to introduce and have read for the first time a bill for an act to amend the Exempted Limited Partnership Act.
Is there a second?
Second.
Ordered that the document be brought up. It has been moved and seconded that the following bill be read a first time and tabled. Exempted Limited Partnership Amendment Bill 2022. Ordered that the bill be read a first time. As many are in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, say nay. Ordered that the bill be read a first time.
A bill for an act to amend the Exempted Limited Partnership Act.
Further first reading of bills.
Yes, Mr. Vice President. Vice President, I beg leave to introduce and have read for the first time a bill for an act to give effect to the Paris Agreement to aid in the global response to the threat of climate change and to create and implement initiatives to offset carbon emissions. And before we second, Mr. Vice President, I will also be seeking the concurrence and the consent of the side opposite that we can do second reading and committal of this bill today as well. And so I so move. Carbon. Yes. Okay.
Is there concurrence? Leader of the opposition?
We undertook that we would debate the carbon bill today, and we have no issues with that. We concur.
Thank you. Is there a second?
Second.
Order that the document be brought up. It has been moved and seconded that the following bill be read a first time and tabled. Climate Change and Carbon Market Initiatives Bill 2022. All those in favor say aye. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say nay. Ordered that the bill be read a first time.
A bill for an act to give effect to the Paris Agreement to aid in the global response to the threat of climate change and to create and implement initiatives to offset carbon emissions.
Further first readings of bills. First readings.
Mr. Vice President, no further first readings. Thank you. And just to, from my feet, thank the side opposite for their consent and concurrence to do the second reading of the carbon bill today as well.
Correct. Second reading and committal of bills. The chair recognizes Senator the Honorable Ryan Pinder.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. You're going to hear from me a lot today. Before I begin the debate, I do want to formally thank the opposition for consenting to the debate on this. It is a rather important piece of legislation for our governance, and I want to thank them publicly. Mr. Vice President, I rise to move for the second reading of the Climate Change and Carbon Markets Initiatives Bill 2022. As the Bahamas is advancing its position with respect to the management of its natural resources for the benefit of its people, and this objective was identified in the Blueprint for Change, the bill provides a framework for the research, the verification, and monetization of our blue carbon credits. Mr. Vice President, from before the general election, when this PLP New Day government took office, the Prime Minister, the Right Honorable Philip Brave Davis, chose at that time that a key plank in his New Day platform and a focused policy priority of his government was going to be for the advocacy and development of key policy initiatives regarding climate change. Upon coming to office in September of 2021, our administration immediately began to highlight issues connected to climate change in the Bahamas. 6 days into office, the Prime Minister addressed the General Assembly of the United Nations. While many leaders were focused on the global pandemic, and rightfully so, our Prime Minister wanted the world to remember that when COVID arrived on our shores, the Bahamas was still reeling from the catastrophic impact of Hurricane Dorian. Most importantly, the Prime Minister made it a priority to remind world leaders that the intensity of Hurricane Dorian was almost certainly the result of climate change. 2 months later, at the World's Leader Summit during COP26 in Glasgow, the Prime Minister made this point to his colleagues. Small island developing states like our own, which are hit hardest by the impact of climate change, are the least responsible for the climate change. But as he does, the Prime Minister didn't just want to focus on the problem. He wanted to drive home the importance of the need of the world to act in this very important area. Mr. Vice President, our administration has not been content to sit on the global sidelines, leaving our fate in the hands of others. Our New Day government will continue to make the case for urgent action. The world is noticing. The Bahamian people are more engaged around issues of climate change than ever before. And the voice of the Bahamas is now being heard more frequently and with more impact than ever before. As the world moves forward to address the causes of climate change, we intend to play an active and powerful role in charting the way forward. The Climate Change and Carbon Markets Initiatives Bill 2022 is clear evidence of this distinct policy position of our government and of the Prime Minister. I am so proud of our leader, Mr. Vice President, our Prime Minister. He has made the correct choice for our country, the right thing, the responsible thing. And those of us who really know the Prime Minister knows that when he knows it's the right thing to do, all of us want to work to make sure that his vision is achieved to advance this great country. Today, Mr. Vice President, we achieve a fundamental component of his vision for all of us, for all the Bahamians throughout our country. Mr. Vice President, today I am very proud to be his Attorney General. As a signatory to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the Paris Agreement, and as an output of its recent negotiations at the 26th Conference of Parties, known as COP26 in Glasgow, it is noted that a significant financial support is needed for the country to advance vital climate change mitigation and adaptation actions, and that an important tool to support these efforts is the engagement of the country in carbon markets. Carbon markets, in its simplest terms, price a unit of carbon dioxide for trade between a buyer and a seller. And it was at COP26 where the Prime Minister recently after the elections went and demonstrated the country's commitment to climate change. And after 6 years of negotiations, the countries finally agreed on rules for international cooperation through carbon markets. The new rules, as outlined in Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, state that countries around the world can trade units or carbon credits with one another in order to access more cost-effective emissions reductions, or in case of the Bahamas, to sell our excess emission credits. In other words, we in the Bahamas will have our natural flora that soaks up more carbon than we emit. So we would be in a negative position, thereby creating the carbon credit. While guidance on the implementation of Article 6 will take a few years to be rolled out, a vibrant voluntary carbon credit market exists, driven by private sector market forces. So that's a voluntary market, a willing buyer and a willing seller at the marketplace. The economic value for the trade of carbon credits is significant. 1 ton of carbon credits in the voluntary market is traded at an average of $55 per ton and has been high as $99 per ton, primarily in the EU, where the framework is a little bit more advanced. This value will only further increase as the Article 6 marketplace, which is primarily the marketplace between sovereigns and governments on negotiation, is advanced, and as countries and private entities must swiftly determine how they will meet the global emissions targets and net zero agreements. See, at present, the goal is to reach net zero for all countries by 2050. What that means is that you should have a net zero position in carbon emissions. So if you cannot reduce your carbon emissions to zero, you have to find another way to get to zero. And that other way is through the acquisition of carbon credits, which will offset your emissions. And the more you emit, the more you are obligated to buy, or the more you are obligated to reform the industries that are causing you to emit. This provides the Bahamas with essentially 28 years to optimally benefit from our carbon market initiatives. Because at 2050, everybody should be at net zero. The Bahamas has significant natural resources as a result of the country's unique flora and environmental protection efforts. The sale of carbon credits can aid the country in further protecting and benefiting from its seagrasses, its mangroves, its forests, and its coral reefs, all areas of the environment and flora that we call carbon sinks, or they suck up carbon emissions. Moreover, many businesses and multinational companies have been directed by their shareholders to engage in stronger environmental, social, and governance practices, what's known as ESG practices. Therefore, the provision of Bahamian carbon credits would prove of mutual benefit for the country and these private sector entities. The vision by the Prime Minister has come to fruition in the Climate Change and Carbon Market Initiatives Bill 2022. This is the differentiating element between this New Day government under the leadership of the Right Honorable Philip Brave Davis. We are doers. Those others were just talkers. Mr. Vice President, this bill shall apply to carbon credits in respect of anything done in, on, above, or below the land and the airspace of the Bahamas, including its internal waters, territorial waters, its exclusive economic zone, including the seabed and the subsoil underlying these waters, its continental, coastal, and marine ecosystems, and its forests. It is important to note that such carbon credits are deemed for the purposes of this act to be property of the Bahamas. In other words, carbon credits generated within the Bahamas belong to the sovereign, the Bahamas. The objectives of the bill are outlined in Clause 4, which are to enable the government to create incentives and implement initiatives to support the overall global target of greenhouse gas emissions reductions, consistent with its nationally determined contributions, which is something that we do on a routine basis. We have to measure our carbon emissions. We have to offset it against what we have as our baseline, and then we put in our goals in the nationally determined contributions. The objective is also to ensure compliance by the Bahamas of all of its obligations under the Paris Agreement, taking into consideration the common but differentiated responsibilities, respective capabilities, and flexibility provisions acknowledged for small island developing states to address climate change. So what that means is we have a subset of rules under the Paris Agreement that apply to small island developing states, knowing and understanding that the capacities of these small island states are different from large global leaders, G20 countries, et cetera. And the objective is also to enable the establishment of a market in the Bahamas to trade in carbon credits. Clause 5 of the bill allocates responsibility for administration of the carbon credit regime between the Prime Minister, who is responsible for the general oversight of the administration of the Act, the Minister of Finance, who is responsible for the financial administration of the Act, and the Minister of Environment, who is responsible for the reporting obligations to the UNFCCC under the Act, as the United Nations Climate Change Committee. Clauses 6 through 8 provide for the appointment of a management company to manage the trade of carbon credits in the Bahamas in accordance with international standards and regulations. This is important. This includes the responsibility for the scientific mapping, the study, the verification of the carbon sequestration. So what that means is the verification of how much carbon we are actually absorbing through our different form of flora, such as seagrass, our forests, our mangroves, etc. It's a highly scientific process, highly technical and scientific process. The management company may also be responsible for the management of the financial products or vehicles related to carbon assets in the Bahamas, because ultimately this becomes a capital markets participation as well. Clauses 9 through 10 provides for the establishment by the Prime Minister of an advisory council, which is to serve as a technical advisory body to the management company and to provide technical advice and recommendations to the Prime Minister on the trade of carbon assets in the Bahamas and the management of those assets. Parts 3 and 4, which are clauses 11 through 18, provide the framework for the fundamental principles governing trade in carbon markets, which are required to meet the obligations of the United Nations framework on the Convention on Climate Change, which we are a signatory, and the necessary actions required for obligations under the Paris Agreement, which we are also a signatory, to ensure an internationally recognized carbon credit marketplace. This is important because if we cannot comply with our obligations under international agreements, the viability of our carbon credit and the marketplace does not exist. This includes all transactions in carbon trading as carried out under this act must result in the additional effect of a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. That's a key component of this. You have a baseline that you are working under, and to get the credits, you have to have some sort of what they call additionality. So you have to have some sort of protection mechanism, or you have to have some sort of way to enhance the absorption of carbon credits rather than just sit with the status quo. So that means the ongoing commitments and ongoing actions by the government are of vital importance to meet this additionality standard in order to actually be able to have a framework to monetize the carbon credits. All carbon offset projects should ensure the emissions are kept out of the atmosphere for a reasonable length of time. All emission reductions must be carefully recorded and documented for every offset scheme, utilizing appropriate accounting terms and adjustments, all required by the United Nations. I think it important in discussion with these international commitments that we recognize that there are particular commitments and concessions provided to small island developing states, a designation that the Bahamas maintains. Specifically in adopting and implementing the provisions of the Paris Agreement, the common but differentiated responsibilities apply to states like the Bahamas. An important component of a successful carbon regime and compliance with our international commitments requires the Bahamas to put in place a framework for the reduction of emissions. This is found in Part 5, Clauses 19 through 21. So we include a framework in this. This is a climate change bill as well as a mechanism to empower the monetization of carbon credits. This provides a framework for us to step into a modern day society, advancing to being a country relevant on cutting edge matters, and have the ability to put in restrictions or guidance with respect to maintaining and reducing our carbon emissions. Part 6, clauses 22 through 26 provides 3 options for the participation in an initiative authorizing trade in carbon credits. So these are the vehicles or the mechanisms in which we can sell our carbon credits into the marketplace. In the introduction, you would have heard me talk about the voluntary carbon market, which is the market where willing buyer and willing seller are at the marketplace. We have a mechanism to operationalize all components of trading in carbon credits as the rules develop. So the three ways to monetize and participate: first, as a result of bilateral or multilateral trading agreements. So we would enter into a bilateral agreement with another country, or a multilateral agreement with maybe a regional multilateral body or some other international body. As a result of trading with a private entity, so that would be rules of specific negotiation between the sovereign and a private entity for the purchase of those carbon credits. Those two areas are still being developed under the rules of Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, of which actually we are at the table in the rulemaking body, so we have an ability to provide our input on how those rules should be developed. The third participation is in a voluntary carbon market, effectively through an exchange where a willing buyer and a willing seller agree a price, or there's a market price developed. These are the designated participations that are accepted in the general framework for the carbon credit market established by the Paris Agreement. Part 7, clauses 27 through 29, provides for the establishment of the National Emissions Registry and the appointment of a registrar to record in a registered items material to the implementation of the Act and international obligations, including emissions, carbon credit inventories, and emission allocations. So you have to be able, as I said, on a continually reporting regime, be able to know the emissions that you are, be able to know what your climate change initiatives are resulting in, and then be able to calculate and inventory the applicable carbon credits that you are developing out of this framework. This is a piece of legislation that is trailblazing internationally. We in the Bahamas are pioneering the blue carbon space. We are contributing to the design of the framework internationally. We as Bahamians should be proud of this piece of legislation. As I said, we are international trailblazers. We are setting the pace. We are leading the charge. We should all be proud of the Prime Minister and his New Day government for being policy revolutionists. The month of April 2022, Mr. Vice President, was a turning point in the economic innovation and diversification strategy of the Bahamas. With the release of the government's white paper on digital assets in conjunction with the tabling and debate on the Climate Change and Carbon Market Initiatives Bill 2022. On the heels of this transformational policy announcements was the successful hosting of Crypto Bahamas, presented by FTX and SALT, where the Bahamas was meaningfully highlighted as the leading jurisdiction for economic innovation, especially in the digital asset space. I mentioned this linkage, Mr. Vice President, because we don't necessarily do one thing in isolation of the other. We have a distinct and well thought out policy strategy where we can build off one innovation just to advance the other innovation that we are doing simultaneously. This is the way the New Day government governs for the best interest of Bahamians. We look to create a digital asset market for carbon credits that would be traded on a digital asset exchange within the Bahamas. This would be the first NFT. You would have heard me talk about non-fungible tokens. This would be the first NFT or digital token tied to blue carbon credits in the world. Mr. Vice President, we are leading the charge of innovation, and we are leading the charge for innovation for the betterment of all Bahamian people. It is an exciting time for our country. While we are at the very beginning of our journey in both carbon credits and digital assets, and we'll likely contend with obstacles and uncertainties, they're new fields and they're both developing rather quickly. But we are optimistic, Mr. Vice President, that we are positioning the Bahamas to participate and lead in these rapidly changing emerging industries. This last month, we have taken a big and important first steps. Mr. Vice President, with that, I want to thank you for your indulgence. I want to thank the other side for allowing us to continue with this debate. And I move for the second reading of the Climate Change and Carbon Market Initiatives Bill 2022. Thank you.
Is there a seconder? The chair recognizes Senator the Honorable Quinton Lightbourne.
Mr. Vice President, I rise this morning in these honorable chambers with a grateful heart to the Almighty God for allowing me the privilege to stand in this place once again. I stand there this morning to second the Climate Change and Carbon Market Initiatives Bill 2022. But before I begin my substantive presentation, Mr. Vice President, I would like to publicly congratulate Team Bahamas on a stellar performance at the recent Caribbean Games. Our country has shown their athletic prowess once again on the regional stage, both in Jamaica and Barbados. At this time, I would also like to express my sincere condolences to the Willy family on the passing of Mr. Jeffrey Willy. He was a member of the national baseball team and a long-standing member of the Royal Bahamas Police Force. May is also Lupus and Mental Health Awareness Month. These are things that we hold and must take great consideration in our country. Mr. Vice President, this bill is not only transformative, but also groundbreaking on so many levels for the people of the Bahamas. This bill shows vision because it would help our environment and diversify our economy. According to the World Resources Institute, the energy sector, including electricity, transport, and manufacturing, is the main contributor of carbon dioxide emissions, representing some 73% of global emissions in 2017. This bill is proof that this government is concerned about our environment and climate change. The Bahamas is extremely vulnerable to the impact of climate change, which is primarily driven by an increase in CO2 emissions. In fact, a recent report from the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change warns that rapid, deep, and immediate cuts in carbon dioxide emissions is required to avoid the world from warming by 3.2 degrees Celsius by the end of this year. A temperature rise would see our planet hit by deep heat waves, stronger storms, including hurricanes, water shortages, and a rise in sea level. But as we all know in here, these are things that we cannot take lightly. One of the key things that I would like to do during my tenure in this upper house is to explain to the Bahamian people what these bills mean and how they can and will impact their lives. Many watching right now may not know what a carbon credit is or what a carbon credit market can do for us as a country. So it is our duty and my duty to explain to the Bahamian public. Simply put, a carbon credit is a permit that allows the owner of it to emit a certain amount of carbon dioxide in the air. The owners of these carbon credits are most times big manufacturing companies that pollute the environment. And they are sold these carbon credits by governments and private firms to compensate for the unavoidable emissions created by their companies. These funds are used to finance projects that reduce emissions anywhere in the world. These credits can then be sold to other companies if one company doesn't need them anymore, and this can create a monetary incentive for companies to reduce their carbon emissions. The companies that cannot easily reduce their emissions can still operate, but at a higher financial cost. Carbon credits increase the health and prosperity of communities around the world, and it combats against climate change by financing projects that reduce the need for fossil fuel. The carbon credit market is created by a company's desire for money. So, the goal of the Paris Climate Agreement is to reduce emissions by charging polluters, but it hasn't been as successful because there are no real incentives for companies to reduce their emissions. Our country plans to capitalize on this, and the cap and trade model is very popular. The cap and trade area was put in place to create innovative ideas for big companies to reduce their levels of emission. The cap would create a shrinking pool of carbon credits that will be available every year and make them more expensive. In theory, companies should want to cut their levels of emission and costs by without buying expensive carbon credits. But big companies tend to do something called carbon leakage, which is when they run from countries with strict environment and regulations to countries that have less restrictions or sometimes none. So, governments all around the world must create the market and set a carbon cap. We must ensure that carbon prices aren't too low because it won't motivate change in the environment. The estimated range of carbon prices needed to achieve the Paris Agreement targets by 2030 is between $50 to $100 per ton. Simply put, there's a lot of work to be done. This market can transcend into a possible financial services industry or financial services niche where we in the Bahamas can sell carbon credits. There are several private companies that offer carbon offsets to companies or individuals seeking to reduce their carbon footprint. These offsets represent investments or contributions to our environment and forestry for other projects with a negative carbon footprint. Buyers can also purchase tradable credits on a carbon exchange, such as the New York-based expansive CBL or Singapore's Air Carbon Exchange. This Climate Change and Carbon Market Initiatives Bill makes provisions for the establishment of an advisory council on the trading and management of carbon assets. Under Article 22 of the bill, the options for participation in an initiative authorizing trade in carbon credits are clearly stipulated. Those options include, number one, bilateral and multilateral trading with other countries. Two, trading with private party entities. And three, voluntary trading. A key requirement for carbon market agreements is the fostering of sustainable development. This means that we will be able to benefit from these developments in the Bahamas. Article 8 of the bill states that any surplus funds must be deposited into either a sub-fund of the Sovereign Wealth Fund or a special purpose entity solely for such a purpose. In November 2021, our Prime Minister, along with the Minister of State for the Environment, attended the United Nations Conference in Climate Change in Glasgow, Scotland, and spoke on the need for a greater global action on addressing climate change. He joined the voices of other Caribbean leaders who, just like us, are perhaps most vulnerable to the devastating effects of climate change. COP26 was the biggest collection of world leaders seeking to make commitments that would bring about environmental changes needed to save our planet. But as there have been dozens of attempts before at the same conference, several world leaders questioned whether this was a waste of time. Queen Elizabeth II herself, in a message, said, "The time for words has now moved to the time for action." Our Prime Minister has shown not just with words, but with action by bringing this bill to Parliament. Our country will be known as a pioneer of ocean-based carbon credits. Right now, people are taking inventory of our carbon sink assets, such as seagrasses and mangroves, and we will be able to sell blue carbon credits on the international market by year's end. The inventory is ongoing, but officials have already identified at least $300 million worth of assets that would be offered on the voluntary carbon market for our natural resources. Other countries in the Caribbean, like Guyana, have focused on the green carbon markets or the green carbon credits, and their Amazon rainforest provides that for them. Our unremunerated asset to climate change is our beautiful waters, and we will seek to be compensated for it. The Prime Minister has seen fit to push for the debt forgiveness from multilateral organizations due to the impact of climate change. Recovering from natural resources has added $5 billion to our national debt. And we, as a small nation, have been victims of climate change, mainly due to big companies who have continuously polluted the environment. This is a bold move by our Prime Minister and one that I fully support. In a newspaper article sometime in early 2020, a young man spoke about the development of a solar energy park on the island of Maguana, where it would be able to fully sustain itself by renewable energy for the Bahamas. Such a project can be done, like what is now in place on the south coast of Jamaica. The Paradise Park Solar Project in Westmoreland, Jamaica, sits under 1,900 acres of land with the capability of generating 51.5 megawatts of electricity. The implementation of a solar energy park on a family island can pave the way and test the viability of running portions of our country on solar and other renewable energy sources. Alternative power solutions are important and beneficial to our environment in the fight against global warming. The Bahamas Development Bank is also playing its part in the green initiative for the country by providing specific financing and funding for renewable energy projects. The Green Vehicle Financing Project will provide 100% financing for business clients wishing to purchase new electrical vehicles. But the BDB will take it one step forward. We are traveling to Auckland's and Crooked Island next week from Wednesday to Friday to help and facilitate business development in the Southern Bahamas. We have not forgotten you, my brothers and sisters. We will be in Spring Point, Salina Point, and Cripple Hill. So please come out to make your business ideas a reality. This New Day government is committed to change. It's committed to empowering and moving our country forward. Mr. Vice President, this beckons the start of great prosperity, both economically and environmentally for our country. I firmly stand and support and second this bill.
It has been moved and seconded that the following bill be read a second time and committed. A bill for an act to give effect to the Paris Agreement to aid in the global response to the threat of climate change and to create and implement initiatives to offset carbon emissions. As many, the chair recognizes Senator the Honorable Darren Henfield.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. I'm privileged to be able to participate in this debate on the carbon bill. But before I get into my substantive contribution here, I'd also like to join the good senator here in congratulating our Griffith team. I also want to congratulate the government, Minister of Sports, for being able to attract the Carifta Games to the Bahamas for our 50th independence. But I want to say to him and to the government, we must do all we can now to prepare them as best we can to be able to keep goal home in the Bahamas as we celebrate our 50th anniversary. I'd also like to extend condolences to the Willy family, one of his nephews is like a son to me. He's often in my house with my sons. In fact, my wife and I take him as an adopted son, KJ, and our thoughts and prayers remain with the family. The Cooper family laid to rest Uncle Sam in Cooperstown last weekend. I wasn't able to make the funeral, but I understand Heather Hunt, was asked to speak on my behalf, and she took my message without even knowing that she was going to be asked. And it was a simple message. I loved Uncle Sam, and Uncle Sam loved me. I was sorry I couldn't be there. And we're still praying for the family. You know, I listened to my learned friend, the Attorney General of the Bahamas, and even though I didn't sense the usual exuberance from him today, I believe the vicissitudes of life and the job are all setting in and weighing you down. So I'm going to pray for you as well, because we you know, we've been where you are, but right now you're not quite yet to the 7-inning stretch, but you're getting there. And you know, I listened very carefully as he said that the Prime Minister, you know, is not on the global sideline, and the world is listening, and that's good. We were all as Bahamians very proud of the Prime Minister at the last COP conference that he attended, and the role he seeks to play in this climate injustice environment in which we find ourselves. But whilst he does that, Bahamians still want to hear him and the government speak to the rising inflation that is now at a 40-year high. Bahamians want him to speak not only in the global community, but to them about the crime challenges that we face. Protection, particularly of our women and children. Bahamians want to hear about, yes, Minister of Economic Affairs, my good friend, Bahamians want to hear about how we're going to address these breadbasket items in the face of all this inflation that we find ourselves. Yeah, you know, it's okay to. We all appreciate, and you know, and this is a position the Bahamas normally finds itself in. Often things that take place outside the Bahamas. The ripple starts outside, and it ends right up on the shores of Abaco and Grand Bahama and Inagua, as we sit in this northern hemisphere of the Atlantic. They wind up on our shores, so it's not good enough for us to say it's outside of our control. We have to be able to do something to address these issues like inflation. Bahamians want to know that we're not going to allow the NIB fund to completely exhaust itself without addressing it. I got a note in my phone. I opened it up and it says, most of the issues that we face in the Bahamas is because we just allowed them to come like the Energizer bunny, just keep going and going and going without addressing them. These are not easy issues to address. You know, I always said this, and I'm a fan of Sir Lyndon. I read his book. I read a number of his speeches. But I always said that if Sir Lyndon had not listened to the pundits when he intended on instituting a national youth service, a youth program, because he got a lot of pushback from the implementation of the Defense Force, and I think that had worn a bit on him. We would not be in the challenge that we find ourselves in today with these young people who don't seem to have any anchor, who don't seem to have any appreciation for their nation and patriotism. I've spoken with colleagues from the military who come from countries where they conscript them into the service. They're not as disciplined as those who volunteer to join the service, but they all know how to salute the flag. They all know how to salute the flag. They all know how to fold their blankets and make up their beds. And so the discipline that it instills and it you know, as we come upon the celebration again, well, not the celebration, but the memorial for Flamingo on the 10th of May, you know, one would recall as a young person joining the Defense Force, and we had young Bahamians from all across this country that joined simply because we wanted to do something about Flamingo. Call it hubris. Probably didn't know what we were getting into, but we wanted to respond. We wanted to do something, and we joined from all across this country, and it taught us most of us who took the training discipline, which is sorely lacking across generations almost now, at least going into the second generation in our country. You couldn't walk around my island in Dundastown and Albuquerque and didn't speak to an elder. My grandmother didn't have a phone, but she would know by the time I got to her house. And she had a window stick that she was quicker with than Clint Eastwood with his Colt 45, You all know what I mean by window stick. On the island, and in the city, you stench the window open. And my grandmother's window stick was very adroit, Bahamians want to hear about these things that touch and concern them. And I understand where you are, because we've been there, where you keep coming to these places, Parliament, and you're doing things that are important, things that are necessary, but things that sometimes don't necessarily touch and concern deliberately in their minds the Bahamian population. And that's a challenge for governments in a modern Bahamas. It's a challenge. So, Mr. Vice President, I wish I could be as optimistic as the Attorney General and what this bill will do for us. But forgive my stoicism, as I have been around for a while now. I've aged a bit, and I'm normally the kind of person who would see the glass half full and not half empty. But this climate change and carbon market initiative bill, which we debate today and will domesticate into Bahamian law in accordance with the Paris Agreement, I don't know that anyone can say with certainty when we will begin to see the benefits from this. It's a good thing. It's the right thing to do. Any journey begins with the first step. And we are on the right path. We should all be optimistic, because this bill will enable us to participate in the carbon market in 3 ways, inclusive of the bilateral and multilateral trading agreements, and trade with private entities, or an involuntary carbon market, in a voluntary carbon market. All of this against the backdrop of rising demand for fuel in the face of the global upheaval due to the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the ongoing fight against COVID-19. As I indicated, 40-year highs in inflation, supply chain challenges, food production issues, low wages, and more. I don't want to go on with that. I like to preach hope. Forgive me, yes, we had a respectable showing at COP26 in Glasgow, Scotland, but we need far more than just a good showing if we are to survive the climate injustice being heaped upon us by the developed countries, who are the principal offenders of climate change. As recognized by the Prime Minister and all others on the planet, we need world leaders to take concrete action on climate change. I've been to many conferences, listened to many talks. Fellas down the road, just south of us, say talks them a run. Many talks. But at the end of the day, there's very little we can tangibly put our hands on to say, this is what we benefited. We are among one of the top 10 most vulnerable island nations in the world due to climate change. But we are not the cause of this climate crisis. And even though we suffer the most, it seems that we benefit the least. Simply put, we are beyond the expectation of the usual promises made by the developed countries to small island developing states, whilst attending these grand and well-choreographed events. We are facing, it doesn't sound like an alarmist here, but we are facing extinction, and just do not have the luxury of the time for more talk and unfulfilled promises by these big countries. We don't have the luxury for that anymore. I've attended far too many of these meetings on climate crisis to harbor any realistic expectations beyond completing their meeting's agenda. In reality, we're just days away from yet another hurricane season. And that's personal to me. You know, I ran ahead of the storm, as I indicated to a colleague this morning, to be in Albuquerque during Dorian, not for politics, but because that was my training. That was my life. I spent my life doing that while I was in the Defense Force. And I thought it would be an opportunity for me to help wherever I could. And these hurricanes are now more frequent. They're now more ferocious because of climate change, because of the climate injustice that we are dealing with. And so, Mr. Vice President, I'm not normally the one to be, you know, the bearer of bad news. I try not to be, because my faith teaches me that I should be otherwise. But seeing the glass half full in this instance, Mr. Attorney General, requires the faith of Job. It does. Until more concerted efforts are made to reduce coal-powered factories, which pump out toxic greenhouse gases and increase air pollution and add dramatically to industrial waste, there's very little cause for tremendous optimism. This, coupled with many other forms of industrial waste activities, spurs climate change, which contributes to the rising sea levels, contribute to flooding and ferocious hurricanes and droughts that cause displacement of millions and uncontrollable wildfires all over the place in parts of the world that we had not seen them hitherto. You know, we're not seeing them before in the way that we do. We're used to seeing them around California and places like that, but they're elsewhere now. In Europe, hitherto, old English prose, right? You know, and Dorian came in on what they call a king tide, right? Which is a super spring tide. And you could hear that thing coming like a freight train, whistling. I mean, if you listen to a freight train, sometimes if you're in the US or just in the movies, you can hear them coming whistling. And when it hit with a thug. And so my fear was that whoever owned the keys, God help us. But it you know, the keys are so narrow. I'm talking about like Elbow Key and Manawa and Guanakee and places like that, because I believe Hope Town really was a part of Ground Zero, as it came right across Hope Town and across Marsh Harbor where we were. And that was my fear. My fear was that, Lord, after this thing is done, what will we find left? But you know, AG, the inhabitants of those keys who've been there since the Loyalists came to these shores are very skillful in handling such events. And by the grace of God, they were able to do the same thing. I spoke with some of my friends after I went over there, and we both, you know, some of us just held on to each other and cried. You know, I look at Hasey and McDonald and people like that who were in their basement. And this is because of the climate injustice. I don't have no time to be apologetic about these things anymore. No time. We have a country to develop, and we have a people to progress, and we don't have time for platitudes and talk anymore. It's time for real action by these people. And you know, you say to them over and over for years, successive governments have been saying to these conferences and all those who would listen at all levels, right? Policymakers, stop assessing us on the basis of our GDP or GNP, and assess us on the basis of our vulnerabilities. Just look at a vulnerability index for us, so that you take cognizance of the fact that we live in the hurricane belt, and we're going to, God forbid, we're going to have hurricanes. And so, you know, we were saying this long before he became the prime minister. I mean, and they were saying it long before we became the government. You know, this was, and I was very pleased in 2019 to hear Antonio Guterres say from his podium in the UN to the world that you have to look at vulnerability for small island developing states, because it doesn't matter what grand plans we make for our infrastructure, for our hospitals, for our schools, and to support our social services and security forces. It doesn't matter. When Dorian comes knocking, you have to respond. You have to respond. And so that's why I believe that it's going to be difficult. You can show me it where you can in the law. I believe it's going to be difficult for you to put any funds derived from this into your sovereign wealth fund. So, if we were to monetize this in any way, the monies will be used, of course, toward building your resilience, which is a part of the agreement itself. Somewhere in here, I made a note of that. Because we are really trying to monetize the harmful impact of climate change on our developing country. I feel that this climate injustice that we face demands no less. It demands no less. Mr. Vice President, I don't believe that any of us who in Grand Bahama, and more particularly in Central Albuquerque, will ever fully recover from, y'all ain't got to say nothing, you on that end there, from Grand Bahama, will ever fully recover from the physical or mental trauma inflicted upon us by Dorian. How do you monetize that, though? How do you monetize? How do you pay for the mental trauma that we were forced to endure? And scientists don't dispute, will not dispute anymore, that the ferocity and frequency of these events directly related to rising temperatures. And we agreed, the world agreed, that you're going to keep these temperatures from rising at least 2% above pre-industrial levels, right? At the Paris Agreement, right? That's what we agreed. And we're still now finding ourselves in a place exacerbated by the Ukraine and Russia, which provides fuel for the world. I mean, some of those countries that ask us to step in, and rightly so, they still getting their fuel. They still getting their fuel from Russia, and ain't man or woman enough to say they won't. Let me behave myself and come back to where I am now. The Bahamas is surrounded by shallow seas and boasts a unique ecosystem with more than 80% of its land within 1 meter of the main sea level. And so for us, climate injustice is not just about some existential or academic pedantic discussion, but it's about our very survival. It's about the survival of our children. It cannot be right that we are the least offensive and harmful black carbon emissions, but suffer the most in results while the offenders continue to prosper. What I am optimistic about, though, however, is the opportunities that we have to make Bahamians less dependent on energy generated by fossil fuels. And Senator spoke a little bit to that. Senator Lightbourne spoke a little bit to that about a solar farm we have to look at more deliberately how we invest in these type of things to cause us to become less dependent on fossil fuels, because the cost of energy is prohibitive to doing good business in the Bahamas, and I believe all across this region. It's just too high. But I'm afraid that perhaps we are not moving as aggressively as we ought to in this regard. And so I want to sound the alarm that we need to be more deliberate, Honorable AG, as we move to reduce our need to rely on fossil fuels. And I've heard discussions since this bill was debated in the House of Assembly. I've heard discussions about the cruise ships that come to our ports and burn harmful fuels. Right downtown in our city, where the cities where they home port in Florida, and wherever else they home port in Maine, they can't burn them there. So why would you come here and burn those bad fuels here, and you can't burn them where you're from? Yeah, we love you. I mean, you provided a good living for us, but let's do practice here. Practice here what you practice at home. Be good corporate citizens. Just to say then, though, that we will reduce our carbon emissions by 30% by 2020, which is just 8 years from now, if I calculated correctly. When is it? 2030. I'm sorry, 2030. That's about 8 years from now. That's extremely ambitious. It's extremely ambitious, and the only thing, well, not the only thing, but I know when we went to Commonwealth Heads, we determined to do away with single-use plastics, and this was very funny for me in the Bahamas, because whilst I was in like them, right? Whilst I was in California in about 2015, for about 15 months, the area where I was in Monterey, they did the same thing. And so we had to get the shopping bags, but I didn't hear all that fussing and cussing that I heard at home, right? What we gonna use? We use these plastic bags for so many things, right? We don't use these bags for some. No. Monterey is fairly, right? You've been to Monterey, right? Monterey is fairly nice on the seacoast, right? A lot of Spanish speakers there, but they're in the salad bowl in the fields, And so we have to be more aggressive. We must provide a roadmap as to how we're going to get there. We just can't make statements. You have to provide a roadmap, give the people due notice, right? That this is what we intend to do. This is the time frame in which we intend to do it. So when we come and say, look, we ain't gonna let you use them single-use plastics anymore, they wouldn't cuss you to high heaven. Provide a roadmap that gets us there. In the meantime, we must, whilst maintaining hope that some of our efforts will get recompense for the damages caused and ongoing by others, we must redouble our efforts toward building resilience in every aspect of our existence, because hurricanes are a part of our natural existence. Resilience must become, to us, far more than a cliche of convenience, but part of our lives. Must. And so Clause 18 and Part 4, I think it is, of the bill, which speaks to domestic mitigation measures, adaptation plans, and other obligations under the Paris Agreement, are equally as important as our quest to profit from carbon credits. And so we just can't, okay, it's good to go after what we could benefit from it, but we too have to put skin in the game, because that's what they're going to ask us when we come. What have you done? What have you done? Yeah, and I applaud the way that the bill holds us accountable. The bill holds not only the international community accountable, but it holds us accountable for our actions and for the steps that we must take. And I was at an event the other day, and Dionisio Riagla, my colleague, I'm praying, continuing to pray for him and his family who lost his mother, who was the rock of his family. And I spoke with someone who said to me, we have these electric cars. And I said, well, I'm in the Senate with the Minister of Economic Affairs, and I'm going to ask him to consider, why the government can't take the lead in this and just we buy thousands of cars in the government a year, right? Yeah, I know you're tempted. You can say it. I mean, I don't mind. We were there, yeah. But you're there now, right? And so yeah, you get to wrap up. You get to wrap up, right? And we could take the lead in this, and then we must consider how we make it more attractive for Bahamians to buy not only the cars, but all the other things that we need to solarize our homes. And we live off what we take on the border and the rest of it. And so Article 4 of the Paris Agreement obligates us to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And I'm happy that we kept our obligations as well. And Article 7 of the agreement requires that we build resilience into our environment. Article 9 obligates developed countries to voluntarily. We shouldn't be in front of them with hat in hand. They agreed to this. I was listening to Eric Solerberg from one of those European countries and Prime Minister Holness from Jamaica on a panel following Dorian when I went into New York for the GA. And they were talking about all this money that they have for the Green Climate Fund. And my only comment to her was, listen, I just left home, we have a very bad hurricane. Talking about the Green Climate Fund and what you put in it, that's all well and good, but how do we get it? If it means then that we know you're collecting it from your taxpayers, if it means then that you must get your European companies to come to the Bahamas and build in underground terminals for power, for cable and other utilities, then I'm sure we could work out a process whereby your companies can bid, and that's the process we're in now. Internationally, we're required when we get monies from some of these lending institutions that from the IDB and whoever else, that we bring or allow their companies to bid. I say, we can go through that process, but just for Christ's sakes, find a way of helping us with the Green Climate Fund, because we recognize that you recognize the obligation to do so. Article 10 encourages the development and transfer of technology and in order to improve resilience. So those advanced countries with advanced technologies that can help us to build our resilience, they're required to do so. I'm wrapping up right now, Mr. Vice. I don't have very long. Article 11 seeks to inspire developed countries to help build capacity in developing countries, right? They ought to help us build our capacity. Help us with advanced warning systems, as they have in their countries, where if a typhoon or a tidal wave is coming, they get advanced notice. Yeah, we track them. Their belts to go off and stuff, go to sea, and they do it on radars and stuff like that. I'm no technical expert, but I've read it somewhere. We can engage technology, advanced technology, developed by these advanced countries, to better assist us in building resilience and in mitigating the impact of these frequent and very dangerous events which we are forced to undergo. And so I end as I started, with guarded optimism, Mr. Vice President. Although this bill might be described as aspirational, it leaves too much outside of our control for us to be overly optimistic about what benefits it will yield. I don't know if we can see any within the lifespan of your administration. I hope we do. I really do. And so in that vein, it is almost certain that such yields will not be realized in short order. And with those few words, I thank you for your indulgence, Mr. Vice President, and I rest. Thank you. Which one? Technology? You mean technology or
as many? The chair recognizes Senator the Honorable James Turner Rule.
Thank you and good morning, Mr. Vice President. Again, this morning I joined my colleagues before me in congratulating the fine Canadian athletes that went to Curriculum and had a good time. They hope for a little more gold, but they performed very well. There's an air of optimism among young people in this country, and it's a good feeling. This past weekend, for a long time, for a long time since we have had inter-island sports on the island. We did have inter-island sports this past weekend, and it was a good feeling to see the young folks breathe a sense of optimism that we thought may have been lost. Again, good morning, Mr. Vice President. It's good to see all my colleagues here this morning, and there's a sense of optimism that exists in the Bahamas, especially among our young people. We saw that with the Caribbean Games, our young folks performed very well. Of course, we always want more. That's the human nature. We want to see more gold, we want to see more success, and we certainly look forward to seeing that when the games return to the Bahamas. I also shared with some of my colleagues that it's been a long time since we saw island sports on the islands following the pandemic, the hurricane, and the like. But this past weekend, inter-island secondary sports returned to Grand Bahama, and I was out there and I saw the amount of enthusiasm among those young people, which was very contagious. So it was a good feeling to see that things are moving and getting back to normal among our younger folks and those on the islands. When I think about climate change and we talk about the Climate Change and Carbon Market Initiative Bill 2022, there are a lot of emotions that come into this one. And as my colleague from Abaco shared just before, when we think of the storms and the ravages and these things associated with climate change, some of it is very troubling. Not so long ago, when people spoke about being a part of a global village, many persons thought it probably wasn't so. It can't be. In fact, we live in paradise. What happens over there doesn't really affect us. We are quarantined from the rigors of urban life and its threats. People really thought that as we spoke of climate change, it was some jargon, it was something that was philosophical, but did not affect us. Well, as we move forward, we see that we are indeed a part of the global environment, and as such, we know that climate change and its effect on small island nations is real. We see that climate change has such an effect on what's happening in the Bahamas that it has given cause for many of us to wake up and acknowledge the impact of a global behavior that is negatively impacting us, even as we are scarcely participants in these matters that could lead to our demise. The Bahamas, which are small islands with low-lying oceanfront borders, is exposed and is especially vulnerable to the effects of global warming and climate change. In many places around the world, many places around this island, in fact, we can already identify the loss of some of the landmass in areas where there once was land and beautiful beaches, but they are now affected at an alarming rate, seemingly as a result of rising sea levels. Now, I must confess that this is startling to observe this process unfolding even in my adult lifetime. The effects of climate change is serious business because of its implications to our future. There is expected certain impacts on small islands, and these include matters such as extreme weather events, and we've been living through some of this, and changes in sea levels, deterioration of coastlines, and we know that such events will affect industries such as fishing, which is big business in our part of the world, and certainly throughout the Caribbean. It also has serious implications on tourism, and tourism remains the goose that lays the golden eggs for Bahamians. So anything that threatens our well-being or threatens the existence and well-being of our tourism industry is a threat to the very existence of Bahamians. The truth be told, with sea levels rising, it is projected that many areas will get worse. Storm surge will be worse. Erosion will be worse. Coastal hazards will get worse. And many other hazards will rear their heads. There was a time when we could say, well, this probably wouldn't happen in our lifetime, so you could kind of step aside and not be bothered. But the truth is, after you would have gone through what we went through with Hurricane Dorian, you cannot just step aside and say this will be cared for later. You have to request that the matter be dealt with soon. These things would threaten the very infrastructure that exists in many of these small island nations. We saw not so long ago that in the northern parts of the Bahamas, when that storm surge hit, there was nowhere to go. And on many of these islands, they could have been easily vanished. Because the truth of the matter is, when the storm surge came in, when the rains came in, when the winds came in, when the force came from the climate change effects, there was no high ground to go to. There was no plane to run to. There was no boat to run to get out of the way. So we have to be careful. We have to be mindful that climate change is causing some things to happen where we live. As we listen to the research and look at the projections, it is mind-boggling to acknowledge that many believe that by the mid-century on many islands, climate change is projected to reduce the already limited water resources to the point that they will become insufficient to meet the demand during low rainfall periods. Can you imagine that? An effect of climate change. If you live in the Bahamas and you've spent any time around the coastal lines, you will be able to attest to the fact that the sea level rise is real. One of the most dominant manifestations of climate change is rising sea levels. Being a global member is important because dealing with emissions is crucial. The reality is the Bahamas is not emitting quantities of most of the gases that's creating the problem, but it's being created by the developed countries, and they, while there is some threat to their well-being, are not as immediately affected as most other areas that we are familiar with in this world. Small island nations do not have such a luxury, and that is why a climate change initiative is so crucial. We must mitigate against the things that threaten our very existence. Beyond the obvious, there are many secondary ailments that come with climate change. We talk about the weather because we see what has happened. But for example, we know that studies have already demonstrated that the existence of fish and other wildlife are susceptible to climate change. Gases that trap heat in the atmosphere, greenhouse gases. Such emissions, especially from developed countries, are creating havoc in certain areas of the world that are not creating these gases in any threatening way. Mr. Vice President, the Climate Change and Carbon Initiative Bill 2022 seeks to achieve a stabilization of the concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere and to keep them at levels that prevent dangerous interference with climates. The Bahamas has ratified the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, or the UNFCCC. It's a document that lays out the framework on matters related to climate change, but while we're still in the early stages, we recognize that this is very important. The Commonwealth of the Bahamas, these islands in the Bahamas, seem now more adequately suited to benefit from carbon credits. We continue to talk so much in our country about diversification. But so often when we speak of diversification, people default to traditional means of diversification. But we know that in an era where the world is our oyster, we ought to stretch our imagination and explore far more of that which is available to us. Climate change, greenhouse gases, and carbon trading are all things that are now relevant to the Bahamas. This act is a good start associated with environmental concerns. It references, and I quote here from the document, from the act, applying carbon credits of anything done in, on, above, or below the land and airspace of the Bahamas, including its internal waters, territorial waters, and exclusive economic zone. In addition, the seabed and subsoil underlying these waters, the continental coastline and marine ecosystems and related waters, and of course, the forest areas. Mr. Vice President, the act has some good properties, and with appropriate management, I believe it will allow the government to obtain its objectives. Primarily, but not limited to, creating incentives and implement initiatives to support the overall global effort of reducing greenhouse gases. And this is noble. It also goes on to ensure compliance under the country's obligation to the Paris Agreement, which is also wise. But to enable the establishment of a market in the Bahamas to trade in carbon credits is fantastic and is good governance on exhibition. As we seek other revenue opportunities, carbon credits are an important bridge to the opportunities ahead. The verification process of carbon credits includes scientifically plotting areas, such as mangroves, seagrasses, seabeds, and forest areas, all of which could function as areas that remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. I really am excited about what I see ahead because things appear to be getting better, but it must be managed as we move the process forward. I'll share with you something that a gentleman by the name of Alan Johnson shared in a message, and I quote what he wrote here. He wrote, "The future is not something that just happens to us. It is something we create every single day, by action or by inaction. Whether the future is good or bad is entirely up to us. As we see the future, we act. As we act, we become the future." When I reflected on that, I thought to myself, nothing can be nothing can be closer to the truth than that short statement that the gentleman provided. The Climate Change and Carbon Market Initiative Bill 2022 is a good bill, and it introduces a new era of progress. As such, Mr. Vice President, I stand here today in full support of this bill. Thank you.
As many The chair recognizes Senator the Honorable Reuben Ramming.
I do support this bill that has been tabled. But there are some concerns that I have. First of all, to make a note and point something out, that this bill in of itself demonstrates to those who would be paying attention to the past 4 years of understanding COVID, that this bill. Thank you. That this bill. Okay. Thank you. My mic was off. Okay. Okay. I do stand in support of this bill. I was not going to speak on it, considering the voluminous things we have to address today, and in the interest of time, I consider it should be in a straightforward bill and something we all should be proud of, considering the fact that the foundation of this bill has been started under the former administration, and it is being taken to its projected continuation under this administration. If you see the environmental bills that would have been passed, and the infrastructure that would have been put in place to take us in this direction, and I do commend our Prime Minister for his part in this. However, it is good that this administration is rightly moving for the possible $300 million in climate credit potential, according to the Prime Minister, that is out there. But it's also good for us to demonstrate that in and of itself is not a panacea. I don't want the public to think that that number that has been thrown in the public by the Prime Minister of $300 million in carbon credit is some sort of slam dunk, or it is a payday deposit into the consolidated fund. Nothing could be further from the truth. I agree with my leader of opposition business that this is something, and it is good and it's right that the work is being done now, that may not fully come to fruition until possibly even the end of this term or even beyond, but it has to be started. It has to be started someplace. In fact, the organizations that we would be applying to get this carbon credit and the related funds actually have some very serious restrictions as relate to government involvement in these processes in the first place. Because our bills that we would have passed, though not as advanced as yours with the foundation, was amended for the very same purpose of minimizing the government footprint or handprint in this particular process, because we found out that it was actually a major issue for donors and other organizations who wanted to invest in these very same things and also submit funds. Because as we know quite well, governments around the world are very lousy in operating and handling funds in this regard. And here the $300 million come towards impacting climate change, which is very, very crucial. And next thing you know, we've sent it towards this bridge here. We sent it on that road there. We sent it to this place here. And then when the next hurricane comes, there's nothing that was been done with the $300 million
for resilience. So I don't want us to assume that it's a panacea, although it is the right thing to do, the right push, and we have to make this push all the time. Let me give an example. Even if the Bahamas was the Garden of Eden, we will still have the antediluvian flood of Noah because of the sins and the atrocities in relation to climate change by the industrial nations. We could be the Garden of Eden, pure, God dwelling here, as Miles Monroe says. But we are still surrounded by industrialized nations that has been impacting us. And not only that, the impact of the adverse deforestation and desertification in terms of deserts being created as a result of deforestations around the world that is actually impacting us. You would have heard me said many times about something called a butterfly effect. A butterfly effect, they said a butterfly could flap its wings in Taiwan and create a tsunami in the Bahamas. And we've seen it. Many of the Bahamian people have never been to the Sahara Desert. But yet every summer we're breathing in dust from the Sahara Desert that travels thousands of miles on the jet stream and lands here in our country. We have still floating adrift a large mass of sargassum, seaweed, that is devastating beaches and other areas in the Caribbean and across many other countries. And it's still a threat to our way of life. These things are as a result of climate change. We've seen, knowing our different currents and the currents in the jet streams that protects our country. Yes, even from things like great white sharks. There's a warm current of jet stream that prevents them. They will not swim through that warm current because they like colder temperatures. That's the only reason why we didn't see great white sharks in the Bahamas. There are things that have been protecting us strategically. That same jet stream was one that was of great concern. Example, when we were discussing matters as related to oil drilling in the Bahamas, and we gave examples of how oil flows in the event of, even in the Gulf and areas in the U.S., if there was a oil leak, how those streams would literally drive oil towards the Bahamas because of the currents and the jet stream surrounding us. But this in itself is not a major panacea, and one of the possible, I wouldn't use the word Achilles heel because it's too tragic. One of the possible impediments that may possibly have to be addressed later, if not for blockage, for slothfulness of response, may be what appears to be the current layout of the managerial structure within this bill of the organizations that will manage it. We know that it's multi-tier, of course, multi-organizations, which are governmental organizations, but the entity itself must not be something that the Institute will see is totally controlled by government. And that's going to be a major hindrance in this regard. So in all this, in short, I see, and I say that it is good to push for the possible cash, but what is the New Day plan to counter what is the real problem here today? The real problem that we have to face, and as a former member of Parliament for Pangwood, things still on your soul, is the impact that we're going to suffer as a country as a result of climate change. Sometimes we get so happy for the money. When I say we, I'm not even talking governmentally, I'm speaking about we, Bahamians. We get so happy for the money that we don't realize that we just would have probably sold our whole heritage. I remember in Foxville, they used to say that the Bahamian persons used to loan the land along the Eastern Road, and they used to farm it, and then a hurricane came, and the other persons sold them land inland and say, no, don't worry about this, man, y'all can farm better inland. So they move off the Eastern Road, and guess where the highest value land is? Along the Eastern Road. I believe, if I'm correct, there may be only one Foxville family still there on the Eastern Road. What I'm simply saying is sometimes we get so caught up for the immediate gratification that we could possibly be like Esau, sell our birthright for porridge. In this instance, with climate change, what we're dealing with, and our Bahamian people need to know, and our government needs to realize a focus that will far exceed their tenure and their term. Actually, this is going to be a multi-decade approach. But the real approach is for us to see as a country how this thing is really going to impact us. If the sea level rises just by 1 meter, and that's about 3 feet, for far as a lot of us who know about the water is concerned, that's a regular tide. That's not even a spring tide. That's the regular tide. We're looking at half of our touristic resorts gone. This is the impact of climate change against us. We're looking at almost $1 billion in terms of our loss as a result of the impact of climate change hitting the Bahamas and impacting our coastal and our shorelines, that we can find ourselves as a country, notwithstanding a mere $300 million, losing billions of dollars and massive chunks of our land, and probably putting us in a state whereas our GDP may even not be as easily restored as we are seeing here even right now. Let me give us an example of what we need to look at again. Let's look at it from a different perspective. If the climate temperature rises by just 3 degrees Celsius, that in and of itself will submerge 67% of the Bahamas. I need us to swallow this. If climate change, if the temperature of the climate rises by 3 degrees Celsius, that's 67% of the Bahamas that is going to be submerged underwater and gone. Moody's had shown, and I'm recalling a Moody's report, that 100% of the Bahamas would be vulnerable to flooding and or submersion under sea level rise if, for an example, 5 meters of sea level rise impact the Bahamas. And why I said that? 5 meters is 15 feet. A lot of us could never imagine, 5 meters, 15 feet sea rise. That's foolishness, Ramin. You're talking literal foolishness. The worst thing that happens is when spring tide comes, water come up in Bay Street, and if it rains, we see Bay Street flooded. Oh, you talking foolishness, you know? All you people who've been laughing at Pinewood and all the administrations who have not been taking it as seriously as it can, the thing about it is, if you've been helping and fighting Pinewood, you could prepare for where we're going as a nation in terms of the fact that, listen, we are to a point right now that as it progresses with climate change, that we can find massive flooding throughout the whole Commonwealth of the Bahamas and immersion or submersion of most of our land right now because we have not prepared ourselves resilience-wise to be able to do what we need to do. There are many countries like Venice and other countries that have the same thing. We remember the hurricane that hit the 9th Ward in the United States. What the name of the hurricane was? Katrina. Nobody realized that all of that section of Louisiana was actually below sea level. They didn't realize it until the dikes or the dams broke. Then they realized where it was. So in other words, let's look at this from this perspective. Right now, we're not under sea level, but what I'm simply saying is that we can prepare ourselves as a nation if other areas have done such a thing in anticipation for what seems to be a direction that we have no control in. Because you can't control the smog in China. You can't control the industries in the US, no matter how much they talk about climate change and these other producers that are causing the global warming that we are going to be impacted with. So the $300 million is really not even a drop in the bucket to protect us and our heritage from what we are about to face. Let's go back to what Moody's actually said again. Moody's has shown that 100% of the Bahamas would be vulnerable to flooding and or submerge should sea level rise 5 meters, which is about plus 15 feet. Well, let me give us an example of that to help us to appreciate that. Dorian brought that level of surge over Andros and Grand Bahama. It's almost like God giving us a foretaste of y'all see what can happen if y'all don't start now, probably 20 years or 25 years before 2050, which is the projected time. We saw in Freeport, Grand Bahama, sharks swimming in the streets after Dorian. And people did not imagine them. I remember Prime Minister Hubert Minnis pleading for people in Abaco, please go further inland. These surges are going to be, and I remember him, I was standing next to him over my head, and he said, I'm a 6-foot tall man. I remember blowhorns going into the shanty towns, and God rest the soul, all those who passed during Dorian, and warning them, move away, move away, move away. Move away, move away. This is no time for games. You're talking about people dead here. Move away, move away, move away. We're talking fundamental things, brother. Fundamental things. Move away, move away. And as a result, we saw so many persons died. And here it is, climate change is giving us the same type of warning as a nation, knowing that we're against the juggernauts whose pollutions are causing us problems. They're causing us problems. And let me give you another example if you're only looking at the money. That seemed just a surge of Dorian, which brought those high waves over Andros and over Abaco and Grand Bahama that people didn't expect to see would have moved in so far, actually cost this country $3.4 billion. And that was at the time. And I could agree with you with that because that is growing. Could you imagine if a possible lawsuit could have been brought? Let me give you an example. The pain, the suffering, the anguish, the loss. If there was a face, let me know these nations that has put us in this predicament. How much billions of dollars in restitution and reparations need to be paid to our Bahamian people because of this climate crime that is actually impacting us? So yes, this bill is something we should celebrate, but we need to understand the reality that we even ain't there yet. So yes, we need more hammering and stronger voices out there to let them know they got their foot on our neck and we can't breathe. And they need to stop this foolishness. There needs to be ways in which they can help us with the level of resilience that we actually need. So I want our Bahamian people to understand, when the FNM administration has expanded our national parks, et cetera, to record level, that was in protection of these same areas that also help to absorb carbon and not only to protect our livestock, our fish, other industries, et cetera. These things that are going on and the presentation made by Prime Minister Davis, it was impactful, but it needs to be repeated over and over again to remind the nation that you're putting your foot on the neck of the Bahamas because of what you've been doing. And through whatever creative means, there needs to be compensation for what is actually being done, and not just through carbon credit, but even more. You know, it's interesting that in cases of war, they could pass $8 billion worth of $8 billion, how much that was? And the aids they want to send over for missiles and stuff, to help. It was 80 billion aid. It's 80 billion aid. We getting hit by hurricanes, by what they cost and thing, and they want to little pittance over here and pittance over there. You know, the engines of war seem to be a greater priority than the sustaining of life and protecting of things that is around. And the Bahamas is the border to the United States. So this bill in itself being something that is good, we also need to look at the long-term road. So long after Prime Minister Davis would have demitted office, this fight will continue going on. Long after the next Prime Minister mid office, this fight will continue going on. This is a massive relay that we're in. And right now, we need to think about ourselves infrastructurally on how we could begin, even if we begin just brainstorming, to begin to safeguard our islands and safeguard our country. And for us, it's almost a near impossible task. And I say almost because I believe in faith and God can do anything. because we are an archaeological nation and we have so much borders to protect, but yet we are in dire strait. Could you imagine 67% of the Bahamas submerged? What that will actually do to us. Moody's also indicated that climate change will also threaten our credit worthiness. So we're not just talking about a hit and a shock, we're talking about potential devastation to our country and our way of life. You're potentially talking about seeing the Bahamas one day, unless something different happens, becoming refugees. That is how drastic this problem actually is. And it is a problem not of our own making. So I commend the government for the passing of this bill, and I admonishing them in repeating again that this is indeed not a panacea where a simple slogan of New Day and patting yourself on the back is going to bring about change or trying to win the feelings now. This is one of the most grave issues. And I'll put it like this, as a cancer you're fighting. And so our Minister of the Environment, our Prime Minister, including even our Attorney General, I commend them on this wicket that they're on, and I encourage them to just keep pushing for every avenue possible, no matter how strange it may seem, to ensure that the Bahamas gets the benefits that it needs as a result of the victimization we're receiving from the international community, the international developed industrial nations, which is causing this threat, this very real, clear, and present danger to our Commonwealth. This is a very serious time. And I want to encourage our Bahamian people, next time you go driving through Pinewood and some of these other states, we're in the rainy season now, and you see that flooding, don't laugh at them. I want you to think that could be all of us if this climate change continue to go. And I'll give you a final example. In 2050 is the time that these things are projected. And the level of sea rise and flooding. And the average mortgage is what, 25 years? The average mortgage is 25 years. And I did listen to the House Assembly where the Minister of House and the Minister of Housing defended claims that were made about homes that were being built. And I heard a comment where she's saying the standard was 2,500 PSI. They pour in concrete at 3,000 PSI. But there is still one reality related to this. The land that they were on does have flooding. And the fact is, right now, nobody wants to be in a situation where their homes are going to be predisposed to flooding. But quite frankly now, those who have never seen flooding before, because of climate change and the fight that we're on, you are all going to be victims. We are all going to be victims to the ravage of climate change. So again, with that, I want to thank the government for advancing this initiative. I wish us good success. I hope we appoint the right set of people. I remind you from understanding what we would have been doing, that it's important with these organizations that it doesn't seem that it's clear that the government is not hand in with this particular thing. They're supporting it, but it's not government run to the extent in the context of which I would have expressed their concern about when monies are paid, does it go here or does it go there? Does it just dump in the consolidated fund, get lost, or does it address the things that the programs would have designed itself to do? So with that, again, I thank the government for this initiative, and I want us all to be aware and take heed.
As many
I think I'm extent.
the chair recognizes Senator the Honorable Michaela Ellis.
Good morning, Mr. Vice President. It is once again a pleasure to rise in this place, even as I recover from my broken toe. With your leave, before I begin my contribution, I want to join in with my colleagues and offer congratulations to our athletes that participated in CRIFTA. I am a swim mom, and so I know the level of dedication and discipline that our swimmers, swim parents, and coaches demonstrate on a daily basis. Swimming like law is a jealous mistress. God willing, I look forward to cheering in the stands at VKK as next year as we defend our 4 CRIFTA championships on our home turf. Interesting fact though, the swimmers say they can't hear us screaming when they are in the pool. I love sports. There's no sport I love more than track and field. My heart and my nerves were in Jamaica that Monday morning when Diore let go of that javelin and it landed on the other side of the record. Yes. There were no words to describe the mixture of emotions in that moment. Diore is my cousin. Diore, named after her great-grandmother, comes from a strong line of women. I have loved her grandmother, Aunt Judy, her mother, Hiltina, and her aunt, Anishka, my entire life. Those women have, in no small way, shaped the person I am today. Our hearts broke in 2019 when we lost Aunt Judy, and her effervescent presence is missed greatly. May her soul and the souls of all the dearly departed continue to rest in peace. Diore, as a nation, we look forward to watching you develop. And as for my part of the Barnett clan, we love you and we are supporting you every step of the way. To all of the CRIFTA track and field athletes, do not underestimate how your performances have reignited a nation that is learning to live with, as my friend Kelly calls it, the plague. We are forever grateful. Mr. Vice President, I rise to contribute to the debate on the carbon credits bill. In the aftermath of Hurricane Dorian, we have seen our own mortality. Climate change is having a detrimental effect on the Bahamas as waters rise and hurricanes become stronger and the risk of natural disasters like tsunamis become a clear and present danger. It is particularly unnerving because as a country, our clean, green, and pristine Bahama land does not actually leave a significant carbon footprint. And natural resources from our waters have been used in groundbreaking research. It is not by happenstance that during the annual Shark Week on the Discovery Channel, several episodes have been filmed in our crystal clear waters, and marine biologists discuss why they come to the waters off Clifton or off West End and Bimini to conduct shark research. We unfortunately suffer the environmental repercussions that have arisen because of the reckless behavior of those larger developed nations. Although we routinely demonstrate that we are more than sun, sand, and sea, preserving our sun, sand, and sea is important not only to our tourism model, but to our existence. I am pleased that we are taking an active role in dealing with climate change. When I read the carbon credits bill, particularly the part of the management company, I could see the fingerprints of my learned friend opposite. This legislation is deliberately drafted, and particularly the management structure. It is, however, my observation that in many other countries, the countries that are paying for the carbon credits usually have a seat and dictate how the receiving entity spends those credits. As with many things, it is a double-edged sword, and I am curious to see whether our structure that remains controlled by the central government will successfully attract purchasers for our credits. Mr. Vice President, this is sexy legislation. As the Attorney General said, this is important legislation, a key plank in their administration. This legislation causes the international community to take note. But, Mr. Vice President, we continue to call for legislation to amend the Sexual Offenses Act and the Gender Violence Bill and formal sentencing guidelines, particularly those that relate to offenses against women and children. Women and children remain the most vulnerable members of our community. We are seeing what appears to be a disgusting uptick in violence against women and children in our community. This weekend, there were reports about a woman who was allegedly attacked by her boyfriend with a cutlass, causing injuries to her head. We were repulsed yesterday by the story of a father that held a gun to his 12-year-old daughter's head. Let me repeat that. He held a gun to his 12-year-old daughter's head and forced her to masturbate while he took pictures. He was granted $7,500 bail. Interestingly, Omar Archer was granted $8,000 bail. Whether we want to admit it or not, women and children in our community are frequently the victims of egregious acts, which can have long-term mental and physical emotional effects. These are uncomfortable topics. Nobody wants to address their mind to these cruel and often sexual acts against the most vulnerable. We have talked about it long enough. We have cried outrage long enough. We have not had substantive legislation to protect the women and children of this country since the 2007 Ingram administration. They commenced the Child Protection Act and brought in place the Domestic Violence Protection Orders Act in early 2012. Successive administrations have failed to take any further steps to offer protection to women and children or to assure that sentences for offenses against women and children reflect our condemnation. This legislation forces us to confront uncomfortable topics, which are often pushed to the back burner to deal with other sexier legislation, like the present one. In fact, I think that our approach to carbon credits has even been mentioned in a Bloomberg article. But we must not get distracted. It has been 6 months since the attack on baby Bella. We cannot and should not rest until there is necessary legislation in place to demonstrate that we, the citizens and residents of the Bahamas, will not tolerate violence and cruelty to our women and children. This is not about politics. This is about the women and children in this great nation. Mr. Vice President, I once again call upon the executive, as the Attorney General said, to do the right thing. It is now the time to really be a doer, to bring to Parliament the bill to amend the Sexual Offenses Act, to remove the rape exception, to bring the Gender Violence Bill, and to format sentencing guidelines. As I close, I offer condolences to the family of Elva Russell Roll, a trailblazer in media, radio, and television, and a fearless F&M. Women like Aunt Elva and Diore's grandmother, Aunt Judy, lived lives which demonstrated an unconditional and unapologetic love for family. And as I close, I wish a happy Mother's Day to all of the mothers, aunties, godmothers, and stepmothers of the Bahama land. You are loved and you are appreciated. Mr. Vice President. The women's stem. Kill it.
As many The chair recognizes Senator the Honorable Michael Halkitis.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vice President. Mr. Vice President, I rise only to make a few comments on the carbon initiatives bill, as I think the matter has been very well ventilated and passionately addressed by senators who have contributed. Mr. Vice President, the leader of the side opposite introduced the phrase. I thought at first he had coined the phrase climate injustice, but it's an established phrase, but he's introduced it into this Parliament, into the Senate, which is an appropriate description, Mr. President, of the situation that we find ourselves in today as it relates to climate change, where climate change, of course, the raising of the global temperature and the accumulation of greenhouse gas emissions, and the injustice and changing of weather patterns, inclusive of more severe storms, more severe drought, sea level rise, etc. The proliferation of greenhouse gas emissions, carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, that was really brought on, or it began to accelerate with the Industrial Revolution that began in Britain and then spread to the US and other parts of Europe and then eventually India and China, so that these developed countries became developed through the Industrial Revolution, which led to the climate change and the greenhouse gas emissions. And so they have become wealthy. And that Industrial Revolution was built, Mr. Vice President, as well, on a transfer, for the most part, of resources from what they fashionably now call the Global South to the Global North. And in effect, the real injustice of it is now those countries have become developed and industrialized, and countries such as ourselves, which are still called developing countries, we are bearing the brunt of the climate change. In fact, it has been called a existential threat, or meaning it's a threat to our very existence. It's a real threat, and we see it in the severity of the storms. We see it in the erosion of the coastlines and the sea level rise, and perhaps we haven't seen it as yet in terms of drought being manifested, but of course we hear of severe drought and the converse, severe flooding and more intense storms wreaking havoc in terms of loss of life and physical damage. And so it's it's injustice indeed, Mr. Vice President, because even when we look at the impact on the Bahamas, and if we were to be able to quantify the amount of money that we, over the years, over the decades, have had to spend on replacing roads, replacing seawalls, replacing bridges, rebuilding homes, rebuilding government infrastructure that have come as a result of severe storms, more intense storms, as a result of climate change. And then you see, we have we can say a fairly good, maybe even 40 to 50% of our accumulated debt over the years, because we have had to constantly reinvest and rebuild infrastructure. And then so now when everybody else is talking about a transition to green energy and oh, what a wonderful thing that would be, we don't have the capacity, your capacity to borrow is limited to make that transition and so you're trapped in this cycle of high energy costs, having to import fossil fuels. It leads to high cost of living, high cost of doing business. And so it is injustice indeed, Mr. Vice President. I think this step that we are taking here today provides an opportunity for us to begin the process of monetizing, meaning making money from, creating revenue from carbon credits realized from blue carbon. And all of us, you know, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Vice President, I'm a bit of a skeptic myself. And so when I hear this talk about blue, not a skeptic, not a skeptic as a, but in a good way, in a good way, meaning, you know, let's see some chickens before we count them. But skeptic in a way that many times, and Mr. Vice President, you know, on Monday would have been 20 years since I was first elected to Parliament.
Oh, congratulations.
And so I've been in and out.
An entire generation.
I've been in and out. What I'm saying, I say that to say, over the years, and especially as you serve in government, you see loads of proposals. And you see proposals, and it's all going to work, and it's going to solve, and it's going to be the panacea, and this is going to be it. And, you know, sometimes some things work, but sometimes they don't. And so I say that when we begin, in coming to office and you know, begin to hear the presentations about, you know, carbon and how we have, because of our landscape, you know, our marine environment, we are good, fantastic sequesters, meaning we absorb carbon from the atmosphere, and there's an opportunity to monetize that. At first, you know, it has to build on you, so you have to hear more. But as we, you know, listen to the scientists, and we see evidence of other countries being able to do the same with their what they call their terrestrial assets, meaning the forest, and now the new horizon, or the you know, the horizon to really be expanded is the blue carbon, meaning carbon that's sequestered in your marine environment, in the coastal. I mean, the first time I heard the term sea meadow was a few months ago. You know, it was just grass, but apparently the grass that's at the bottom of the sea that grows there absorbs carbon and holds it from the atmosphere. The same thing with salt marshes and mangroves. Coastal tidal marshes and mangroves, it absorbs carbon and holds it there, and that has a value. And apparently, according to the scientists, that the ability of the coastal marine ecosystem to absorb carbon is 2 to 4 times or even higher than when you're talking about mature forests. So we have an opportunity, if we are able to monetize it and put a value to it. There's a process. There's a process that, you know, it has to be verified, has to be mapped. You have to find a way to market it, and preferably not a one-time sale, but an ability to gain revenue recurrent every year. To be able, how do we do that? To be able to get some money every year. You have to protect that environment, and then because it has to be verified periodically. It sounds futuristic, Mr. Vice President, and I'm sure a lot of people are skeptical. And the question did arise today as to, well, what does this mean now for the man on the street, the housewife, et cetera, who is experiencing some hardship? And I will come to that. But when we talk about futuristic, Mr. Vice President, I want us to remember the situation with the overflight fees. It took many, many years of negotiation. It crossed several administrations. But now I'm advised that this fiscal year we can expect to get between $28 and $32 million to overflight fees. That's the estimate. It's important that we're able to get that money, Mr. Vice President, but what's even more important is now moving to that next level of expanding our control so that opportunities in terms of aviation management, accounting in that area, aviation regulation, aviation finance, the whole legal aspect of managing that space, operations, so that we can have a transfer of knowledge, a building of our local capacity, because we are advised that there's a potential for many hundreds, perhaps even thousands of jobs in that particular sector of managing your space. And so, yes, it's good to have the dollars, but it's even more important to be able to say to your young people, here's some opportunities, your bright young people, here's some opportunities that you might wish to explore. These are opportunities that will be available. And it's a similar thing as we talk about carbon credits and building this type of regime, I believe, Mr. Vice President, because there will be opportunities to build capacity. There'll be opportunities to have that knowledge that those scientists who have come from abroad to share with us, to have transfer that to our local experts, our students at the University of Bahamas, build capacity in the area of marine biology, conservation, the whole financing and financial aspect of carbon trading and how do you value it and how do you monetize it. Legal framework, there'll be room for lawyers and people who have to negotiate these things, and opportunities for careers. If we grab it and we push it and we're really serious about it, Mr. Vice President, we cannot fall in the trap of just talking about it and thinking that, sometimes you talk, and then time goes. You have to be able to take action. And so again, it provides an opportunity even for the diversification of our economy, because many times when we talk about diversification, we think agriculture, fisheries, manufacturing, but these skills-based sectors, knowledge-based sectors are also excellent opportunities if we take advantage of it. And if we ensure, and we have to ensure that we have that knowledge transfer and that capacity building so that we're not 10, 20 years from now still paying consultants to come in and tell us how to negotiate and how to write our agreements. It is future-looking, Mr. Vice President, and I believe that benefits will accrue to future generations. When we talk about natural resources, there's a lot of talk about it, and we have to decide how we will balance the temptation to mine and exploit our what might be in the ground or under the sea, and balance that against the value of leaving it in the sea. Is it more profitable to take it out and sell it, or is it more profitable to have it there to provide a global service and be paid for that service? The leader opposite spoke, Senator Raming spoke about global resources that are available for things, and sometimes, a lot of times, you go to meetings and they say, we have this amount available. We have this available, right? And now the talk is that when it comes to green finance and climate finance, we will use the multi-vulnerability, there's one more word, the multi-vulnerability analysis, or index, the multi-vulnerability index. So don't worry about per capita income. You'll be able to get the money. But that remains to be seen. But we have to keep pushing, and we have to make the applications. We have to push, and we have to hold those people accountable, and hold them to what they promised. There's a lot of technical assistance and expertise available where we can gain have access to that and avoid some of the mistakes that were made by the countries who have gone ahead of us. But I think we must push, and it is an opportunity. We might not see the benefits today as in terms of everybody getting a payday, but I believe that if we are to be faithful to what is envisaged in this legislation, future generations will benefit. There also is the possibility, there's another very in vogue, I've used that term, meaning many people are talking about this whole issue of ESG financing, environmental, social, and governance, meaning that if you make certain investments in conservation, particularly of your environment, it makes you more attractive in terms of when it comes time you need to raise financing, you can do it cheaper. and even when it comes to foreign investors looking at your country, you get a score, so to speak. So that is another positive thing to analyze and see how we can benefit from it. How does it affect the ordinary, what we call the ordinary Bahamian? I believe we have an opportunity to diversify our revenue sources. Might, depending on how much this realizes, we can look at how we make some adjustments. We get to a big part of it is being able to concentrate on preserving your environment, and so that's important. We create opportunities for careers will be created, and I think it's very exciting. The Attorney General, in moving the legislation, referenced the crypto conference that took place and the digital assets and the opportunities to have these two converge. And when we talk about carbon trading, how do we do it, you know, on a digital platform? And so there are opportunities for that. So exciting opportunities for young people, and it's up to us to make sure that we bring it to fruition. It gives us an opportunity to find a way to finance our transition to what they call green to renewable energy, simply meaning how do we move from burning diesel and gas to create electricity to using the sun, which we have in abundance, and possibly when, how do we make that transition, which has proven to be difficult because it's expensive and countries just don't have the capacity to do it, and which will lead to a reduction in the cost of energy. So there's a lot of opportunities here, Mr. Vice President. I'm happy that the management of this whole initiative is between the OPM, which gives the clout, the Ministry of Finance, which gives the finances, and as well the Minister of the Environment, which will ensure that the environment is protected. So I think it's a strong regime. And I think that if we can be faithful to what we are proposing here today in terms of putting this in place, we can be assured that future generations of Bahamians will have the advantage of reaping those benefits of a protected environment, a green environment that actually works for them, and keeping on the front burner of discussion this whole issue of climate change, because it's not enough for us to create credits and then trade them with someone who is emitting, who is doing emissions, so that they can reduce their score. We have to look at the whole bigger picture of reducing emissions, reducing the impact of climate change, because for us, it's truly a matter of our very existence. So I support the bill, Mr. Vice President, and thank you very much.
As many The chair recognizes Senator the Honorable Maxine Seymour.
Okay. No, man, I just in my studios, I paid attention to what was going on. Thank you, Madam, Mr. Vice President. It's good to be here. I rise on the occasion of our discussion of the Climate Change and Carbon Market Initiatives Bill 2022. Before I get into it, I would like to extend sympathy to Alva Russell Roll's family. Alva Russell Roll was buried on Saturday past, as mentioned, and also to Leah O'Brien's family. She will be buried next week. And like so many of my other colleagues, to the family of Jeffrey Willy, who is being buried today, and the families of all other loved ones who have passed. May their souls and the souls of the faithful departed rest in peace. And speaking of the souls of those departed, Mr. Vice President, May 10th is approaching, and we all know that on May 10th, 1980, the HMBS Flamingo incident occurred, and there would have been persons on board who would have paid the ultimate sacrifice in defense of our nation. And so I want to remember them at this time and ask that we pause for a moment of silence to do so. Mr. Vice President, there were those who survived, and yesterday I had the opportunity to speak to one of the survivors of the HMBS Flamingo, and that would have been Cladwell Farrington, who told me that he was in Eleuthera, yes. He told me that he was calling from Eleuthera, and he was one of 2 radio operators on board at the time, and he has since written a book, and I encourage all of us to pursue a copy of that book. I haven't gotten my copy yet, but I do intend to do so that we can like Senator Henfield, have a copy of it and really understand a little bit more about what took place on that fateful day. Mr. Vice President, we're talking about climate change and global warming, and for me, I ask the question, when did this discussion that we're having in 2022 start? Well, some say it began in 1896, when a Swedish scientist actually first predicted that changes in atmospheric carbon dioxide levels could substantially alter the surface temperature through the greenhouse effect. Then in 1938, I understand that Guy Callender connected carbon dioxide increases in the Earth's atmosphere to global warming. Of course, since then, many things have happened. And I think in 1988 in particular, research tells me that was a watershed moment when global warming was again placed in the spotlight because we had the hottest summer on record at that time, and also drought and wildfires in the United States in particular. So I have to say that this is an ongoing discussion that has taken place over centuries, it would seem. And to me, those who paid the most attention to it would appear to have been Hollywood movie producers who decided that, oh, this is happening, let's tell a story around it. But like we've established here today, those that are most likely to be impacted severely by it are people like us in countries like the Bahamas that we've already seen have been impacted through worsening storms over time. And we have to do something to reduce the emissions. And I'm happy that we are here now presenting this bill, tabling this bill, because those who pollute, the polluters, should be charged and should be made to pay and at least purchase these credits from countries like ours. And of course, we get to monetize it. We get some benefit from it economically, of course, like our good minister. I wait too for the money to be in the bank, because then we'd actually have it. And, but at the same time, it's good that we are making legal steps toward what we agreed to during the Paris Agreement in 2016, I think it was. And obviously that was an international treaty on climate change that has legal implications. And so here we are today with our blue carbon credits and being able to really make money of what God has given us and God has blessed us with. I always say that here we are in the Bahamas, and we talk about all the time, we are a small but mighty nation, and we have a lot going for us. As mentioned by multiple persons, our Carifta athletes would have done exceptionally well. I think we had 3 records broken altogether, and she mentioned DRA Scott is one of them, and there's so much to be proud of in our nation. And we are small compared to other nations, but God has placed us in a place where when persons are in space, astronauts are in space, they can reflect on the beauty of our waters. And our waters, our marine culture is rich. And over time, again, like the scientists who warned ahead of time, persons at the Bahamas National Trust and elsewhere keep advising us to be cautious about how we treat our marine environment, how we take from it. We've had, of course, their closed seasons for grouper, and they keep pushing conservation, and we really need to really be good stewards over what God has given us in the Bahamas in terms of our ocean. And so, yes, while we monetize it, we also need to take care of it and be good stewards over it in terms of what we do and holding others accountable. And so, yes, we've talked about the cruise ships and others. We have to be good stewards because pretty much It's what we have. And God has given it to us because he knows that even now we can benefit from it in so many ways. We find food in the ocean. Now we're going to be able to monetize it through carbon credits. You know, we find leisure on the ocean. We're able to connect with other countries through the ocean in terms of travel and so much more. And so we have to guard and care for the ocean just as we take this step in terms of the climate change and carbon market initiatives bill. And so just as scientists have warned us, we are now taking more steps and further steps in hopes that it's not too late and that we can do our best by 2050 when our children and grandchildren will be around in order to make sure that they have a Bahamas to live in and that we can really preserve the country that we know so that they may grow in it and so that we don't have to have a mass exodus and end up somewhere else as Senator Ramming would have pointed out, being refugees trying to flee to other countries that are higher level, or I think now is also the time to strongly consider, developing Cat Island a bit more, because we have to find high points. But even then, like I said, there's very much a lot of concern with where we're heading with climate change and global warming. So this is a good step, and we do hope to be able to really practicalize what is happening here today. Mr. Vice President, I'll take a moment to what I call pause for positivity and mention that there is still good news in the newspaper. And I see that the Girl Guides are on the move. And I was a Brownie and a Girl Guide. And I have to say that in this feature in Monday's paper, we see the ranger and guides in North Eleuthera. We see them doing some farming. We see the ranger and guides in San Salvador planting trees. And we see the ranger guides in Crooked Island picking up trash. And organizations like this that teach our young people to be responsible when it comes to the environment and to really do what we can to make a difference are to be commended. Mr. Vice President, we talk about the environment and we talk about the big companies and the industrialized nations, but we all must do our part when it comes to the environment and trying to make the world a better place in terms of caring for where we live. I said it recently, we had Earth Day, and as I would have said to the children who tonight again will gather virtually on Zoom for a reading that I do bi-monthly with children, like I said to them at the last reading occasion, we are all earthlings, Mr. Vice President, and as such, Earth is our home. It's no other way to put it. And being our home, it's the only place we have to live. And so we can't just decide that we're gonna go and live somewhere else. This is where we have to live, and we have to care for our home. We have to care for our home in order to be able to continue to live in it. And this is what we're talking about today, and this is what, in general, we all need to be better at. And it's not just the industrialized nations who we need to have responsible for doing things to improve the environment, but it's each of us as citizens and residents of this great commonwealth. If our vehicles need to be repaired, then perhaps we need not drive them. But it's certainly not fair to the environment or the motorists behind us to have to, really breathe in all of that carbon, dioxide or monoxide or whatever it is that pollutes the environment, pollutes our lungs. And, people drive along as if they don't see it or as if they don't know. But this is something small that we could all do as individuals to help make the environment better. When it comes to our vehicle, again, whether or not, I think as KB put it, whether or not we have a very qualified bush mechanic doing our repairs, or however we decide to make that oil change or whatever, we could properly dispose of the oil. These are all things that as individuals that we can do to help make our environment better. If we see trash, just pick it up. Pick it up, Mr. Vice President, and put it in the trash can. It's that simple. Don't walk over it. Don't turn an eye to it. We can all do things in our own country to help make our environment better. We could plant trees. As I just said, as the ranger and guides are doing in San Salvador and North Eleuthera. We can plant trees, Mr. Vice President, because we need oxygen. And we need that oxygen that the trees emit. Trees help us in so many ways in terms of the environment. We talk about the price of fuel, and Mr. Vice President, it is rough right now on the streets. It really is. And that's just a fact. And so whether it's the cost of fuel or whatever it is, because, we keep talking about it, but we've heard that nothing's going to be done about it. And so what we need to now do is figure out how we could save money in order to carpool. We can catch the public bus if necessary, but we have to find a way to survive and to help the environment at the same time, Mr. Vice President. And so again, I am very pleased that we are tabling this bill and that we are seeking to really monetize our blue carbon credits and really be able to trade and really benefit from some of those industrialized nations who I hope in getting credits will also look at how they could be better at what they do in terms of being more environmentally responsible, because it's not just about getting credits and then building more factories and it's really about trying to at least do better in terms of the way they care for the environment and what pollutants they put in the Earth's atmosphere. Mr. Vice President, my remarks are very brief, but it would be remiss of me if I stood today in this honorable place and I did not put on record some of what the last administration did in order to help with the environment, because governments are continuous. And so, yes, we are here today, but there are also steps that we took in order to help the environment. And I think that in terms of Senator Raming would have spoken to it, we would have introduced progressive and protective legislation to protect our environment. And we talk about future generations, but the last administration would have been the one to ban the use of single-use plastics. And as simple as we think that is, that's a very big deal. And so all the straws and all the food containers and, everything else, all of the disposable plastic cutlery that we would have banned, and the bags, because the amount of bags that were being imported, the plastic bags, and that were not ending up properly disposed and ending up in our landfill and in our oceans and impacting our marine life. It was completely unacceptable. And so we banned the use of single-use plastic, and I encourage this current administration to make sure that that is being enforced. Because if we don't keep an eye on some businesses, then they are very likely to be tempted to, revert to some of those bad practices. And so let's just make sure that there's not the single-use plastic. And of course, we made significant strides in maximizing solar energy, Mr. Vice President. I want to remind everyone that a 925 kilowatt solar park car canopy system was completed at the National Stadium. I want to remind the New Day government that we did install a 250 kilowatt solar energy retrofit at Anatole Rogers. We completed construction and awaiting a mobilization. We were awaiting mobilization of the 390 kilowatt solar utility grid on Long Island. We implemented bulk waste programs over the Hill and in other communities, as well as our derelict vehicle removal program. And most importantly, Mr. Vice President, our memory can be very short and cloudy at times, but I would really like to remind everyone about the new landfill in New Providence that the last administration helped to fix. And because if we choose to remember, we know that there were constant fires and constant challenges, and that we couldn't breathe in fresh air or anything like that based on the last landfill and the situation. And in fact, I think I might have said that I would have met a family who lived nearby the landfill who had to literally send their little child to live with a grandparent on the family island because of the constant lung issues resulting from the dump fires. And so we as governments of our country, we all try our best to do our part to help the environment, because we've said it. It impacts us. The storms, they impact us. Those are our families who were in Abaco, who were in Grand Bahama trying to escape Dorian. it's unimaginable. And like said, I mean, we cannot get back. There's no way to monetize the mental trauma. I would have interacted with children who would have relocated to New Providence after Dorian, Mr. Vice President, who for many months, and in fact, even still, whenever the rain we had this morning, the basic rain we had, the thunder, the lightning, impacts persons who had to live through that storm in a very real way. Persons who had to see, bodies floating, things like that. You don't just get over. And the impact, I mean, I don't even know if there are enough qualified psychologists in our country to give the kind of intervention needed to truly move beyond that experience. And we're this close to the start of yet another hurricane season, Mr. Vice President. And so this is a good step, but we all too must continue to push industrialized nations, push at COP, push as much as we can, but also just do our part. Just pick up the trash. Just pick up the trash. Just take it from the beach with you. If you brought it to the beach, just take it with you. We don't want a little turtle or whatever other animal to be swimming and be trapped in some can or something for the rest of their lives, unable to get out, unable to get food, just because of our irresponsibility. We have to give consideration to what we do as stewards of our country. And indeed, of course, we have to hold the major cruise companies accountable. But it's also important for us to do our part to help make our environment better. And so, Mr. Vice President, I support the Climate Change and Carbon Market Initiatives Bill 2022, and I look forward to the funds coming in, the funds hitting the bank in terms of those blue carbon credits that we're able to trade to other countries around the world. Thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Mr. Vice President, seeing as it's about the lunch hour and we're near the end of this debate, I would like to move that the business of the Senate do continue beyond 1 p.m. today.
Is there a second? It's been moved and seconded that the business of the Senate continues beyond 1 p.m. All those in favor say aye. All those opposed say nay. The motion passes. As many The chair recognizes Senator the Honorable Aricia Hepburn. Is your mic on?
Yes. Good day, Mr. Vice President. I rise in support of this climate change and carbon market initiative legislation. But please allow me to express my condolences to Mrs. Angela McKenzie on the passing of her brother, Jeffrey Willy. His funeral was this morning at 10 a.m. The Bahamas is the first country in the Caribbean to take this bold step to address climate change through the use of marketing climate credits. Bahamians have no problem being the first to chart the waters of progress. And with the leadership of our progressive Prime Minister, I am certain that we are well on our way to ensuring success in this initiative. Mr. Vice President, I think it is clear that we understand the dire need for ensuring climate-smart choices. I know I do not have to remind this august body about Dorian. If for no other reason, this is why change is necessary and necessary now. A noted scientist defined climate change as a state of the climate that can be identified using statistical tests by changes in mean and on variability of its properties, and that persists for an extended period, typically decades or longer. Major countries adversely affect SIDS, small island developing states like ourselves, disproportionately to the amount of carbon pollution that they give off. As a researcher, I had the opportunity to attend conferences and do work with Jeff, that's the Global Environmental Fund. One of their current projects is the Livelihoods Carbon Fund 3, which will build an innovative and replicable investment model that will invest in community-based solutions to restore natural ecosystems and establish agroforestry and regenerative agricultural systems in developing countries that will ultimately reduce greenhouse gas emissions, increase carbon sequestration, generate certified carbon offsets to climate responsibility corporates, and contribute to small the SDGs while delivering a steady and positive financial return to financial investors. These are the types of creative solutions that we bring in the Bahamas in this party. In the previous COP21, where the Paris Agreement was determined, there's been much criticism. In the article, Paris Climate Change Deal, Too Weak to Help Poor, critics warn of the myriad of issues in this agreement. In particular, Richard Chatterton, head of the climate policy on the group, which provides analysis used to investors, said, the deal reached in Paris is too weak, containing no concrete increase in the level of ambition to address climate change, and simply urges countries to do more over time. Here, we are doing more. We understand that we cannot depend on other countries for what's best for us, and this legislation is a way forward. Article 9.1 of the Paris Agreement states, developed country parties shall provide financial resources to assist developing country parties with respect to both mitigation and adaptation and continuing of their existing obligations under the convention. However, here we are participating in COP26, and the reality is that several governments' failure to meet the 2009 pledge to provide $100 billion annually in climate finance for low and middle income countries by 2020. We are in 2022. Reports suggest that it'll take another 2 years to reach this goal, and we have not yet, and that around 70% of the finance will be provided as loans, which is ridiculous because they created the problems. We all assumed that it would be grant finance. We didn't pay attention to the fine print or expected that developed countries would hide behind loans, says climate economist Tariq Banru, a former director of sustainable development at the UN. COP26 states the Bahamas is a part of informal groups of 42 small island states, an observer called the Alliance of Small States, which is the intergovernmental organization which was established in 1990 during the Second World Climate Conference in Geneva. This organization plays an integral role in carrying out advocacy for small island developing states and influencing international environmental policy, which share fundamental concerns about the threat posed by climate change. Following one of the tenets on our blueprint for change, seeking climate justice, our Prime Minister, while addressing the conference, indicated the need for action, specific and concrete policy changes, and support by financing and technology transfer, which is urgently needed to build resilience. Mr. Vice President, as stated before, a recent survey taken indicated that most Bahamians are not aware of climate change and have no idea what mitigation or adaptation is as it relates to climate change or how to participate in those strategies. I hope this debate today will inform them. We are not major climate polluters. We know. We are the ones, however, that feel the effects sooner without change. There's growing momentum in the international community to ramp up climate finance for mitigation and adaptation actions. Undoubtedly, a focus on climate change adaptation in the developing world must be the priority for financing. At the same time, there's a rallying call for countries to focus on post-COVID-19 recovery investment on green and resilient pathways that take into consideration urgency to address climate change priority. Mr. Vice President, I would be remiss if I did not mention that at BAMSI, we are teaching environmentally climate-smart agriculture and mariculture. Coupled with this, the adoption and mitigation students learn, we are well on our way to having an educational paradigm shift that incorporates sustainability. I encourage all to enroll. Piggybacking off of Senator Seymour, BAMSI partnered on Earth Day with Scotiabank to plant several trees at several schools throughout New Providence. I also stand in unison with Senator Seymour as she indicated we all have a part to play, regardless of how small. Not just picking up garbage, turning off our lights when they're not in use, ensuring that we conserve our water, ensuring that we use reusable things instead of just always printing out paper. I actually made this portfolio. So we encourage people, yeah. Boy, if you know the struggle. I encourage all of us to do more reusable instead of all the wastage. Because even though it's a small step, small changes have maximum impact. Mr. Vice President, in closing, to ensure that balance between mitigation and adaptation outcomes and the way forward for our country to assist in the climate fight while garnering resources to support, we have to implement this climate change and carbon market initiative legislation. With this, we have a pathway for climate success. God bless us, and God bless the Commonwealth of the Bahamas.
As many
For the wrap up, Mr. Vice President.
Yep. The chair recognizes Senator Honorable Ryan Pindo.
Sorry, I don't need that one. Thank you, Mr. Vice President. I want to thank all colleagues here in the Senate for their debate today on a novel and revolutionary piece of legislation that falls in line with our government's commitment to diversify the economy, to be revolutionary in our policy initiatives, and to advance things in real time and not to wait. Just a couple of matters that were raised during the debate, Mr. Vice President, that I would like to just discuss and provide a little bit more gloss on. I think, and rightfully so, Senator Henfield spoke about matters related to the reduction in carbon and matters related to ongoing commitments in the future, not only for creating carbon credits, but our international obligations on emissions reductions. And I think he specifically spoke about possibly governments looking at electric vehicles and otherwise. I'm pleased to advise the senator that the Ministry of Works has given a directive that all of their new cars, to the extent that supply can accommodate, will be electric vehicles. And the Minister of Works is on putting together a framework to ensure that there are adequate solar charging stations distributed appropriately. And I say solar because we would know, and there'd be criticism that you would get an electric car, then you plug it into the grid and just increase the demand on your utility and your electricity. But with the forethought of Minister Sears, he's going to have solar charging stations placed out for his fleet. And so this government, we're living by example, and we're undertaking that. I think the senator also spoke about matters, and especially cruise ships and the pollution that cruise ships, and he's right. Cruise ships are one of the more significant polluters in our waters and frankly, everywhere they go. And key function of that, Mr. Vice President, is certainly the cruise ships have to go from point A to point B, and we understand that. But it is when they go to point B and they have to keep their generators on and to extent their engines on to be able to accommodate the ship and all of the activities. While in port, the ship still has to function. Lights still have to be on. Air conditioning still have to run. And then that is a primary polluter because they're sitting in the port polluting our air. And I took note, and I sent this to one of my colleagues just last week. There was an article in the Miami Herald in which the cruise port in Miami is committing to install shore power connection in the different areas for the respective cruise ships, the different terminals. And so I raise that issue in that, one, we should be approaching, and we will approach the cruise port as they develop here with respect to the option of having shore power connections so these boats don't have to run and pollute our atmosphere while they sit in port. And to the senator's point, to the extent that that could be solarized and not to be a drain on our power supply, it absolutely should be. But there's a second step that I think that we should advance with the cruise ships, and I gave my recommendation that we should engage on this, is when we have provided the opportunity for cruise ships to have private islands throughout the Bahamas. And that's just a policy decision that all administrations have undertaken. Right or wrong, it is what it is. But on those private islands where it is their infrastructure on the island, their infrastructure should also include enough generation capacity to require these cruise ships to plug in when they're at their own islands, and therefore reducing the carbon emissions generated from the cruise ships in our waters and attributable to us as a country, because we pay that carbon emissions price, not them. We do as a sovereign. They come into our country, but they should have mitigation efforts. And so those discussions are beginning with the cruise lines, which will, to Minister Henfield's point, reduce our baseline of carbon emissions as a country. And when we reduce that baseline, think of it as a balance sheet. When you reduce your baseline on one side, you increase your profit on the other side with respect to carbon credits and how many carbon credits and the viability of those carbon credits. So those are active discussions that were underway and active policy initiatives to address those issues. Also, with respect to the electric vehicles, I don't want to preempt my colleague on my left, but I would just ask the opposition to pay attention to the budget, and especially the line items with respect to electric vehicles. With respect to the timing of the benefits that we are going to undertake, and then certainly a lot of that is based upon scientific research and a verification process, but we believe that we could be seeing some of the first benefits from this initiative in the next 12 to 18 months. So certainly long before our administration ends, we expect to be able to see some benefits. Now, because of this process, it is an ongoing process. And we anticipate that any benefits that we do receive year after year will actually increase year after year, because there are only so much scientific mapping and verifications you can do in a given time frame. So, every year we will be mapping new areas and verifying new areas, and which would create additional inventory of carbon credits for our benefits. So we do anticipate we will start at one point, but it will ratchet up with respect to inventory of credits. But also as time goes on, the valuation of the credits should go up, because we are approaching that end date of 2030, and then in some instances 2050, to when we would have a net zero anticipation. One of the key points, and he's absolutely right, the Senator Henfield, he's been reading, I can see that, but he's also the former esteemed Minister of Foreign Affairs, so he was in these types of matters. There's an obligation with respect to resilience and building resilience. And he's correct. There is an obligation with respect to resilience. Now, we have a unique benefit in the Bahamas in that mangroves provide a significant resilience barrier to storms, especially on coastlines of low-lying areas. And you've seen some planting exercises that have happened to raise awareness. But certainly a component of this is going to have to be a mass planting exercise to continue resilience. And one approach from a policy point of view that we're undertaking with inbound investments in the country, and we know inbound investments and foreign direct investment is a fundamental part of our economy. But what it also does is it scars the land, and it does other adverse environmental consequences. One thing that we're advancing is that in these instances, we want the developers to be at least a net zero impact, which would mean that they would have a positive impact due to deforestation or scarring of the land or building structures. That's a natural, but they have to commit to the opposite. They have to commit to whatever resilience or remediation activity the government suggests them to do. So that may be you have to plant over the 3 years that you're developing, you have to plant 3 million mangrove plants in specific resilient areas. And they would either be on coastlines where vulnerable to hurricanes, for example, or they may be in existing protected areas such as the west coast of Andros, which is almost an entirely protected area by the National Trust, and actually a very good location conducive to mangrove planting. And so that is a policy initiative we're putting in place to have this net zero impact. But when they have the net zero impact, we do it in a way that maximizes our carbon absorption and sequestration. And so those are policy initiatives underway to address some of these issues with respect to that. We heard a lot of discussion about big country restrictive mandates and what we're going to be able to do because these big countries are going to impose restrictions. And the fact of the matter is that's just nothing new to us. We live in this environment day in and day out, industry by industry. It is what it is. It is the consequence of being a small island developing state with very little economic muscle compared to these other countries. What we have to remain is nimble. We have to remain at the table. We have to remain in the rulemaking bodies and advance our people at the table to give our input. And so, we were committed to doing that. Dr. Charles Hamilton is a special advisor to the government of the Bahamas, but he's also a special advisor to the United Nations on Article 6 matters. And so, we have people that are placed strategically to try to achieve that. Now, I'm not saying that it's going to be easy, not saying we're going to get everything we want, and not saying we're, all of that is rosy, but you have to be committed, aggressively committed to being at the table and striking, your balance and what is good for you. And lastly, there was the discussions, my colleague to my left here spoke about ESG, environmental, social, and governance initiatives. And one thing that we believe is possible and probable, especially in the early days of monetizing and inventorying carbon credits, is that we would be able to use that activity to wrap sovereign debt. So ESG, environmentally conscious debt. And so what that means is if you borrow as a sovereign and you use the proceeds for environmental, social, or governance matters, you get a preferential interest rate. So instead of 8.5% that we may see in the open market now, because it's a specialized ESG purpose debt, you may get it at 4%, right? And then if you wrap it with a carbon credit that is monetized, so there's a security feature there, you may even get it less than that. And so those are the big picture kind of sovereign financing, balance sheet, monetary policy things that we're looking to do as a government to continue on a continuation basis to ensure that we are in a much better stead and can have the flexibility needed to govern more, I guess, grandiose and offer much more larger policy solutions to many more issues that present themselves that have financial constraints. And so that is the goal that we are undertaking, to take this and to take it to the next level and to rebalance our balance sheet, rebalance our monetary policy as a holistic approach and create a much more sustainable country in which we are to live. And so those are just some of the items that I wanted to raise on the wrap up based upon some communication and questions from colleagues. I do appreciate the time for everybody to allow me to do this wrap up. I thought it's important to clarify some of these issues. They are national issues. They're not political issues. They're governance issues, and they're issues to reset the country in a place where we can enjoy benefits of this new modern global economic society and culture that we now live in. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
It has been moved and seconded that the following bill be read a second time and committed. A bill for an act to give effect to the Paris Agreement to aid in the global response to the threat of climate change and to create and implement initiatives to offset carbon emissions. As many are in favor will say aye. Those who oppose say nay. The motion is carried. Order that the bill be read a second time and committed.
A bill for an act to give effect to the Paris Agreement to aid in the global response to the threat of climate change and to create and implement initiatives to offset carbon emissions.
Further second reading of bills.
Mr. Vice President, at this time, I would like to move for the luncheon suspension. And so I would move that the business of the Senate do suspend until 3 p.m. this afternoon.
Is there a second? It has been moved and seconded that the business of the Senate be suspended until 3 p.m. As many are in favor say aye. All those opposed say nay. The ayes have it. The motion is agreed. The business of the Senate stands suspended until 3 p.m.